All right, everybody. Welcome back to another reading hour. This will be the reading hour for August 26th, 2025. All right. So, picking right back up with the Gladio book. We last left off on the section Papal Pipe Dream. For several months, for several months, the letter served to quiet the concerns of the Ambrosiano shareholders. Remember, this was the letter from the official Vatican office, like with the official letterhead, just to say that all these fictitious companies that were created for the purpose of money laundering were actually real companies that the Vatican controlled. Um, and it was just this letter of patronage that was just to give legitimacy to all these uh, fictitious companies, basically. So, for several months, the letter served to quiet the concerns of the Ambrosiano shareholders, while Pazienza gained the necessary backing for his plan. The bailout of $1.2 billion was in place, with the group agreeing to accept the 16% of Ambrosiano stock held by the shell companies as equity. The investors intended to purchase more shares at an inflated rate from interested sellers in order to obtain a 20% holding. Quote, this would grant them ownership of one of Italy's most prestigious banks. The matter seemed settled. Calvi uttered a sigh of relief. No one expected John Paul II's reaction. The Pope opposed the plan, according to Pazienza, for the sake of a quote, pipe dream. In a 1986 interview with the news magazine L'Espresso, Pazienza explained, quote, the Ambrosiano, in the Pope's eyes, was to represent the modem, or the modern secular arm of the Church in the world. The new temporal power was seen as the penetration and control of financial and publishing activities, including the acquisition of Corriere della Sera, Italy's leading daily newspaper, to counterbalance the secular and Marxist influences that were becoming ever more preponderant in Italy. Hmm. So this guy is saying that modernity is leading to just Marxist influence and secular influence everywhere, and that's a major problem. So the Catholic Church has to take control of newspapers and buy up media companies in order to counteract that. The Pope's belief that the Church could weather the crisis and take ownership of Ambrosiano was reflected by optimistic statements from Archbishop Marcinkus. In March 1982, as the storm clouds gathered around the Holy See, the Archbishop, in an interview with Italian magazine Panorama, said, quote, Calvi merits our trust. I have no reason to doubt. We have no intention of ceding the Banco Ambrosiano shares in our possession. So expressing confidence that these are real financial concerns. These are not just fictitious companies. It's not just made up money for the purpose of laundering. Remember, they have to just create this level of confidence so the whole thing doesn't go belly up. So the next section here is botched job. While Marcinkus was making this pronouncement of trust, Robert Rossone, the general manager of Ambrosiano, was making a new demand for Calvi's dismissal as director and for a quote call on all loans that had been made to the Vatican. Rossone was causing unnecessary agita or agitation. Pazienza responded to the demands of the troublesome Chiacchierone or Chatterbox by contacting Flavio Carboni, who was connected to Banda della Magliana. Carboni issued the contract. On April 27th, Rossone was shot by an assailant with a pistol as he left his apartment for work. Okay, so who was connected to Banda della Magliana, which I can't remember what that translation was, but band of something. So it's obviously some kind of like terrorist group or hit squad that he was able to call on to get rid of this guy. The hit had been entirely botched. Rossone managed to survive the attack, and the gunman turned out to be no ordinary Magliana street thug, but Danilo Abruzzati, the leader of the notorious gang. Why would Abruzzati attempt to conduct such a hit by himself? The Magliana boss had dozens of cugines or lackeys at his beck and call. He had amassed hundreds of millions from the gang's involvement in robbery, kidnapping, prostitution, gambling, and drug trafficking. Why would a criminal of his stature accept a contract for the killing of a man of no obvious significance? Such questions were raised by journalists throughout Italy, and Banco Ambrosiano came under increased scrutiny. Okay, so exactly the opposite of what they wanted. They did not want more scrutiny and more looking into these fishy transactions, but there we go. It also just makes you wonder, like, how do they come out of all of this? It's like, how do you even have such a massive blow up of something like the Banco Ambrosiano scandal that reveals the P2 Lodge, reveals all of Gladio, and then still people continue on as if these were not the major influencing events that controlled so many Western governments and literally created the Fourth Reich that the West lives in now. On May 31st, 1982, the Bank of Italy wrote to Calvi and his board of directors in Milan, requesting a full accounting of the lending to the Vatican's 8 shell companies. The board, under increased pressure, voted 11-3 to comply, despite Calvi's protests. So yeah, even the board of directors is saying, let's just let them see the documents. Let's just be transparent here. The last thing Calvi wants. A papal petition. Knowing the shell game had been lost, Calvi turned to the Holy Father with a last request for deliverance. In the letter dated June 5th, 1982, he wrote, quote, I have thought a lot, Holiness, and have concluded that you are my last hope. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. I have been offered help by many people on condition that I talk about my activities for the Church. Many would like to know from me whether I supplied arms and other equipment to certain South American regimes to help them fight our common enemies, and whether I supplied funds to Solidarity or arms and funds to other organizations of Eastern countries. I will not reveal it. I will not submit, nor do I want to blackmail. I have always chosen the path of coherence and loyalty. He added, quote, The Vatican has betrayed and abandoned me. After documenting in writing the Holy See's involvement in arming guerrillas, engaging in bloody war, and misappropriating funds, Calvi continued, quote, Summing up, I ask that all the money that I gave to the projects of serving the political and economic expansion of the Church, that the thousands of millions of dollars I gave to Solidarity with the express will of the Vatican, and that the sums which I provided to organize the financial centers and political power in 5 South American countries will be returned to me. Those sums would amount to $1.75 billion. He concluded the letter by saying he was, quote, seeking serenity and, quote, to live in peace. Oh my God. Can you imagine, like, the cojones, the balls on this guy to be like, hey, I know I did a whole bunch of like dirty work for you, the Pope, and like one of the most powerful institutions in the world, fighting the dirty communists, propping up regimes, overthrowing democratically elected ones, murdering people, assassinations, the money laundering, the drug trafficking, all of it. I know that I was taking part in all of that, and I was pretty much the mastermind of it. And for many years, and I was doing all the work that needed to be done to make that float. But I just want to live in peace now. I just want you to give me back the $1.75 billion that I funneled into all these companies and made up. And then I want you to just leave me alone. I think that's a good deal, right? Imagine. Next section here is Lapsi Linguae. Writing such a letter to the Vatican at this point would not result in Calvi's living in peace, and only produced increased concern that the banker was becoming unhinged and might attempt to make disclosures that would place the CIA's major covert operation in certain jeopardy. This concern became intensified as Calvi began to pack away documents in his black leather briefcase and to confide in friends, including Prime Minister Andreotti, about the IOR's involvement in money laundering and wholesale fraud. Quote, if things go a certain way, he now told Flavio Carboni, his new best friend, quote, the Vatican will have to rent a building in Washington behind the Pentagon. A far cry from St. Peter's. Yeah, a little bit, little hubris there. A little bit self-inflated sense of your own importance and what you're going to be able to do to this massive institution. Calvi, when he was making these remarks, was not aware that he was being taped. A few days before his departure from Milan, Calvi again complained to Carboni about the Vatican's refusal to pay its debts. Quote, the Vatican, he said, should honor its commitments by selling the wealth controlled by the IOR. It is an enormous patrimony. I estimate it to be about $10 billion. To help the Ambrosiano, the IOR could start to sell its patrimony, in chunks of $1 billion at a time. So yeah, he's got a whole plan for them to just like sell off their massive $10 billion stakes without causing some kind of market panic and then like decreasing the value of the very thing they're selling off. Just sell it off little by little. He's a genius. Financial doomsday is the next section here. On Thursday, June 17th, came the coup de grace. Il Sole 24 Ore, Italy's cautious and conservative financial newspaper, published the complete text of the Bank of Italy's letter to Calvi and the Ambrosiano directors. Ambrosiano stock went into a freefall that resulted in complete collapse. Rossone and 2 other directors appeared before Luigi Manini, deputy director of the IOR, and Pellegrino de Strobel, the IOR's chief accountant, and demanded payment on the loans that the Holy See had received for its offshore holdings. They presented the 2 IOR officials with a letter of patronage that they, along with Archbishop Marcinkus, had signed and sealed. By any banking standard, they insisted, the letter represented a statement of financial obligation. Marcinkus was contacted by telephone. He was accompanying the Pope on a trip to Switzerland. He responded to the demands of the Ambrosiano directors by saying, quote, "We just don't have that kind of money." When warned that his response would be reported to the Bank of Italy, the Archbishop said, quote, "I know. I did all this to help a friend, and look where we are." Rossone later recalled his reaction, quote, "I became as angry as a buffalo. I told them, meaning Manini and Distrobel, that this was a criminal conspiracy. They had committed fraud. The letter of patronage was from the IOR, and it was a guarantee. All that was missing was the signature of Jesus Christ." Wild. Yeah, again, that letter, just because it comes from the Vatican, bears that level of authority and weight for these people. So, an emergency meeting was held on the fourth floor of Ambrosiano's headquarters. Panic reigned. Accusations were exchanged. Threats were made. Lawyers were summoned. When a degree of order was restored, Calvi, by unanimous vote, was removed from his position at the bank. The board was dissolved, and the bank was placed in the hands of a commissioner from the Bank of Italy. A new warrant was issued for Calvi's arrest. But the cause of so much turmoil was nowhere to be found. The previous week, Calvi had made his escape from Milan. He was now one of the world's most wanted fugitives. The day after he vanished, Graziella Courachere, the bank's 55-year-old personal secretary, fell or was hurled from the fifth floor of Ambrosiano. The body landed with a thump on the ramp leading to the bank's underground garage. No arrests were made, and the cause of her death remains undetermined. Wild stuff. Again, many such cases. So many cases of these people just like mysterious deaths, poisonings, whatever. And yeah, it's never investigated. Nobody thinks it's like odd at all. What can you do? You know. Sorry, folks. I just had to plug in something real quick. Yeah, a lot of cases. Anyway, telltale documents. On June 11th, while packing his bags, Calvi told his son Nino, quote, "I shall reveal things, which once known will rock the Vatican. The Pope will have to resign." Again, wild level of hubris, wild level of just delusions of grandeur for this guy. He stuffed several documents in his black briefcase, which came to light in 1987. One was a note concerning Jelly, which read, quote, "He had convinced me that all political and financial power really depended on him, and that no deal of any importance could go ahead without his consent." The note further stated that Calvi had never made a decision regarding the transfer of funds to the shell companies or weapons for the Latin American dictators and guerrilla armies without conferring with his worshipful master. In a letter, Calvi said that the Vatican needed him to launch, quote, "an effective politico-religious penetration into secular society by securing control over banking institutions." So yeah, it seems like he's really just going hard on like showing that these people were involved at the highest levels with every aspect of this, like all the worst parts of it, which of course they want to shield themselves from. They don't want that to be the impression that people get. What's up there, Petrocell? Good morning. Yeah, these people are so clumsy. It's wild how yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just like they are just humans. They're just incompetent people at the end of the day, even if they've been able to like uphold charades for decades on end. It helps when you have like major organizations like the CIA pretty much giving you all of your overhead and organizational backing that you might need. The enormous importance of what I have just said induced me to incur debts in foreign currency in order to buy Banco Ambrosiano shares in sufficient quantity to guarantee IOR control over the institution. So continuing with that quote from Calvi, yeah. Working for the Vatican, he added, meant providing financial assistance to guerrilla units and strong-arm regimes. He wrote, quote, "On more than one occasion, I believed that my life was at risk as I rushed from one Latin American country to another, seeking to oppose the ferment of anti-clerical ideologies. I did my utmost in every sense to the point of concerning myself with the supply of warships and other war material to support those capable of contrasting the advance of well-organized communist forces. These efforts, he maintained, ensured that the Vatican would have an authoritative presence in countries such as Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Paraguay, and Nicaragua." Nearly 4 years after Calvi made his escape from Milan, Bishop Pavel Hnilica of Czechoslovakia paid Flavio Carboni $6 million on behalf of the Vatican for the contents of the black briefcase. On April 1st, 1987, an Italian television news program opened the briefcase before its viewing public with great flourish. The contents had been depleted, but the remaining documents showed that Calvi had been pushed beyond the breaking point and was ready to employ blackmail in order to obtain reparation for the Ambrosiano's losses. 7 years after the program was aired, a Roman court convicted Carboni and Bishop Hinilica of being in receipt of stolen money, or of stolen property, sorry. Okay. So, do we find out what happened to this Calvi guy? Looks like we might. The next section here is Escape to London. Leaving Milan, Calvi made his way to the seaport of Trieste, where he boarded the Outrongo, a launch that had been used by Stibum for drug smuggling, and sailed to the small fishing village of Muggia in Yugoslavia. He was met by Carboni, who drove him to a safe house in Austria where he received a passport that was genuine in all respects except the name of its bearer. Roberto Calvi had been crudely but simply adjusted to Gian Roberto Calvini. On June 14th, he was flown to London on a plane that had been chartered by Hans Kunz, who had been a player in Stibum's Guns for Drugs operation. The Austrian businessman had been involved in providing Exocet missiles for use by the Argentine military junta in the Falklands War. The order had been placed by Gelli. The funding had been provided by Ambrosiano through a Vatican dummy corporation in Panama. Okay. So that's like also why these corporations are useful. These like fictitious dummy corporations, it's like you can do real things with them. You can do real arms shipments and transfers. You can do real money for drugs deals with these companies that you just created out of thin air. I mean, that's how all companies are, really. The brothel and the bridge is the next section here. In London, Calvi was placed in an 8th floor flat of a seedy apartment building off King's Row that served as a brothel for a louche clientele. L-O-U-C-E. L-O-U-C-H-E. I've never... What is that word? Lush, maybe? Is that how you pronounce that? The hiding place had been secured for him by Carboni, who booked lodgings for himself at a luxurious London Hilton. Calvi, growing increasingly morose and frightened, spent the next 2 days in a squalid bedroom, stretched out on a cot, staring at a television and making telephone calls. He spoke several times with his daughter Anna in Zurich, telling her of the danger she faced and imploring her to leave Europe for the United States. Quote, "Something really important is happening," he said, "and today or tomorrow, all hell is going to break loose." On June 17th, the body of Roberto Calvi was found hanging from an orange noose under Blackfriars Bridge in London, his feet dangling in the muddy waters of the Thames. He was wearing a lightweight gray suit, an expensive Patek Philippe watch, remained on his wrist, and $20,000 was stuffed in his wallet. Wow, okay. In his pockets were 4 pairs of eyeglasses and his doctored Italian passport. 5 bricks had been stuffed in his trousers. Okay. Cool stuff, yeah. Masonic symbolism is the next section here. So yeah, I guess we do, in fact, find out what happened to Calvi. So, Masonic symbolism. The sight of Calvi's demise immediately aroused suspicion. Members of various Masonic lodges in Italy wear black robes and address each other as friar. Black friars, or fratelli neri, is an Italian nickname for Freemasons. There is even a Black Friars Lodge, number 3722 in the quote list of lodges Masonic, the official register of European masonry. The fact that masonry in the form of bricks was found on the body was deemed significant, as well as the fact that the Masonic oath stipulated that traitors should be, quote, roped down in the proximity of the rising tide, or in the proximity of the rising tide. I guess that it just ends there with no period. Sorry, guys. Okay. Very cool stuff. I mean, how sad can you be about that happening to that guy? What a piece of shit he was. It's like, come on. Chapter 19, Killings and Kidnapping. The main reason why De Pedis is buried in the Basilica of Saint Apollinaire is that it was he who put an end to attacks by the band, and not only against the Vatican. These pressures by the Banda were due to money on loan to the Vatican through Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano and never returned. Okay. So this band is actually like attacking, I guess, Vatican officials other than just Calvi. After the Orlandi fact, even though all the money was not returned, De Pedis, who was building for himself a future in the upper middle class, worked through reference prelates to stop the violence. Among the things asked in return for this mediation, there was also the guarantee of being buried in a distant death there in Saint Apollinaire. Antonio Mancini, bagman for the Banda della Magliana, I guess the newspaper or the publication is called La Stampa, July 27th, 2011. So Calvi's death was first ruled a suicide by a coroner's jury in London, but the verdict was quickly quashed and a second jury declared it was unable to decide between murder and suicide. The investigation continued for many years. The Italian detectives remained convinced that the banker must have been killed. I mean, after all the symbolism, What, you think he killed himself and then he stuffed the bricks in his pockets? It's like, at the time of his demise, Calvi was 62 years old and overweight. He suffered from poor eyesight and pronounced vertigo. To commit suicide, he would have had to overcome impressive obstacles. As Peter Popham explained in The Guardian, in the pitch darkness, he would have had to spot the scaffolding under the bridge, practically submerged in the high tide, stuff his trousers and pockets with bricks, climb over a stone parapet and down a 12-foot long vertical ladder, then edge his way 8 feet along the scaffolding. He would then have had to gingerly lower himself to another scaffolding pole before putting his neck in the noose and throwing himself off. In 1998, Calvi's body was finally exhumed, and a coroner determined that the man who had been known as, quote, God's banker indeed had been murdered. I guess, how many years after can you exhume it and then still tell that? And then you're going to leave us without the detail that proves that? Okay. I mean, we already know. We fucking know that he was murdered. The Strangler speaks. In the wake of this decision, Francesco, quote, Frank the Strangler, Di Carlo, the heroin traffic manager for the Sicilian Mafia, testified that he had been approached to kill Calvi by members of the Corleonesi crime family under Capo Giuseppe Pippo Caldi, the mob's cashier. Interviewed in 2012, the notorious Supergrass, or British slang for informer. Wow, I didn't know that's what that meant. There's a band called Supergrass. He said, I was in Rome and received a phone call from a friend in Sicily telling me that a certain high-ranking mafia member had just been killed. I will never forget the date because of this. It was June 16th, 1982, 2 days before Calvi was murdered. The friend told me that Pippo Callo was trying to get a hold of me because he needed me to do something for him. In the hierarchy of Cosa Nostra, he was a general. I was a colonel, so he was a little higher up, my superior. When I finally spoke to Pippo, he told me not to worry, that the problem had been taken care of. That's a code we use in the Cosa Nostra. We never talk about killing someone. We say they have been taken care of. It's very funny. It's like old hat now. Calvi was naming names. No one had any trust in him anymore. He owed a lot of money. His friends had all distanced themselves. Everyone wanted to get rid of him. He had been arrested and he had started to talk. Then he had tried to kill himself by cutting his wrists. He was released, but knew he could be rearrested at any time. He was weak. He was a broken man. I was not the one who hanged Calvi. One day I may write the full story, but the real killers will never be brought to justice because they are being protected by the Italian state, by members of the P2 Masonic Lodge. They have massive power. They are made up of a mixture of politicians, bank presidents, the military, top security, and so on. This is a case that they continue to open and close again and again, but it will never be resolved. The higher you go, the less evidence you will find. Okay, yeah, I mean, sounds very true. That's pretty much a description of like this entire book. De Carlo, on another occasion, said that Vincenzo Casillo and Sergio Vaccari, two members of the Camorra with ties to P2, had received the contract for Calvi's murder from Callo and Licio Gelli. Casillo and Vaccari were killed by a car bomb shortly after their return to Milan. In case Casillo had engaged in some pillow talk, his mistress, Giovanni Matarazzo, a nightclub dancer, was murdered in her apartment by the Camorra assassins. Okay, so yeah, they're just cleaning house. They're tying up all the loose ends, as they say. Crazy. Anybody who could possibly know about it, you're done for. Which is also wild. It's like, why would you even take on these contract killing jobs if you know that that's probably what's going to happen to you if they want to hide any evidence? Anyway, so I'm going to bookmark this one here, and then we can switch over to Western Marxism. So continuing on here with the Western Marxism book. Western Marxism lost sight of these two theoretical motives, the birthplace of historical materialism. It, above all, in the last stages of its existence, rather than identify the steps taken in historical time, even in the apparently most abstract theoretical elaborations by great philosophers, sought with great zeal to cover them up. The nexus that connects Heidegger and Schmidt to the Third Reich is explicitly declared. Just as clearly, Nietzsche's theorization of slavery as the foundation of civilization harkens back to the stances of political and intellectual circles throughout the 19th century that opposed and criticized the abolition of black slavery in every way. Of course, situating an author in his time does not negate the theoretical excesses in his thought. Writing of Linguet, who in the 17th century called for the introduction of slavery in France as the intrinsic essence of work and the inevitable foundation of property and civilization, Marx has no difficulty clarifying his acuity and profundity. This did not mean he felt the need to immerse the French author in a bath to cleanse him of every political and ideological incrustation. In this way, instead, Western Marxism proceeds. When facing the effort of historical research, it prefers the lazy arbitrariness of the hermeneutics of innocence. I'm kind of curious, what were the two foundational principles we left off on last time that they were talking about? I would have to read too far back to summarize it, but apparently there are two theoretical moves, and they are the birthplace of historical materialism, but Western Marxism doesn't incorporate them. No better fate has befallen the second theoretical move of historical materialism, not so much the one that invites us to see the presence of historical times in even the most abstract ideas, as much as the one that imposes recourse to the concept and the effort of the concept to understand the most immediate events. We can begin by saying that the desks of the exponents of Western Marxism have often been quite different from those of Hegel and Marx. Presumably in 1942, Horkheimer did not have a quote, an immense number of newspapers at his disposal, or maybe he did not have time or the desire to read them. He could express his disapproval and his indignation about the silence imposed by the leaders in Moscow on the idea of the withering away of the state only because he was badly informed about the real situation. The Wehrmacht was on the verge of accomplishing the goal of transforming the Soviet Union into an immense colony forced to furnish the Third Reich with an inexhaustible quantity of raw materials and slaves. Horkheimer lacked the essential elements of historical consciousness, so his conceptualization was vacuous. Rather than a philosopher determined to conceive and promote a radical project for transforming the world, starting from the contradictions and the conflicts of the present, he was a prophet who pined nostalgically or from love for a world that would be entirely new, one without any relationship to the gigantic conflict between emancipation and de-emancipation occurring at that moment. Only in this way can we understand Horkheimer's position. Otherwise, we must read him as a self-caricature or as proof of the comic effects resulting from a sense of being pushed to the extremes. We can reach an analogous conclusion if we read Empire by Hart and Negri. We have seen them announce the end of imperialism and the advent of, quote, perceptual and universal peace, cheerfully celebrating the triumphal conclusion of the war against Yugoslavia and the demonstrated ability of the West and its leading country to sovereignly wage wars in every corner of the world. While all around journalists, ideologues, and celebrity philosophers explicitly rehabilitated colonialism and imperialism and invoked and legitimized in advance the wars needed to silence those that would dare challenge the Pax Americana. Once more, we are forced to ask ourselves, what newspapers were on Hart and Negri's desks when they proclaimed the utopia of a world without war? Yeah, don't you love that kind of like idealism, like total privileged detachment from reality to say, like, I guess this is like maybe in the 90s or whatever, like, uh, to say that this is a world without war, that we've reached the end of history, that like this is Pax Americana, we have this rules based international order, while the US goes around just brutalizing everybody, like just decimating countries, destroying whoever gets in their way. And like they're even explaining here, propping up the media beforehand to justify all of it before they do anything. And it's exactly the same situation today. All the people who would overlook atrocities done by the West back in the 90s are doing the same thing today. It's a different generation, it's their children, but they're still doing the same exact liberal, head in the sand bullshit. Marcuse is a particularly interesting case. We have seen him make clear with precision why a still underdeveloped country that seeks to escape colonial subjection needs a strong state economically and politically, but subjective hopes and aspirations end up overwhelming analytical lucidity. Marcuse says, quote, quantitative change would still have to turn into qualitative change, into the disappearance of the state. And perhaps, quote, at least in some of the liberation struggles in the Third World, we find a more important novelty, the advent of a, quote, new anthropology. To give wing to such emphatic hopes, confessed the philosopher, not without some hesitation, was some vague news that was at first sight of little relevance. It was, quote, a small item that I read in a report about North Vietnam, and that had an effect on me since I am an absolutely incurable and sentimental romantic. It was a very detailed report, which showed, among other things, that in the parks of Hanoi, the benches are made only big enough for two, and only two, people to sit on, so that another person would not even have the technical possibility of disturbing. It is a perplexing passage, and not only due to the prodigious capacity for anthropological regeneration it attributes to the Vietnamese bench. Did it really make sense to go looking for a new anthropology of undisturbed lovers in park benches, respectful of intimacy in a country exposed to massive bombardment by the US Air Force? Once again, the prophet takes over from the philosopher. And this tendency can also be read in Zizek's disdain for the anti-imperialist struggle, which for him distracts us from overthrowing capitalism. During the US Civil War, Marx was forced to struggle against those who, in the name of the struggle for socialism, preached political indifference. In the United States, the North and the South, the capitalists were in power, and slavery was alive and well, whether it was wage slavery, also denounced by Marx, or black slavery. Those who argued this way did not grasp the gigantic emancipation implicit in the abolition of true slavery. This method of argument, widespread in Western Marxism, contrasts with Hegel, for whom the universal always assumes a concrete and determinate form, and with Marx's lesson that it makes no sense to see, quote, real struggles as trifles, or Lenin's warning that whoever searches for a quote, pure social revolution will never find one. Yeah. Like, imagine trying to paint both Russia and the US as equally imperialist and just disregard the entire Ukraine proxy war as just inter-imperialist infighting and not realize that, like, it would actually be a significant emancipation if the anti-imperialist bloc won in this situation and people were freed from being under the yoke of the empire, the only one that actually exists. So section 6 or chapter 6 here, East and West, from Christianity to Marxism. Born in the heart of the West with the October Revolution, Marxism spread to every corner of the world, penetrating forcefully into countries and areas in backward economic and social conditions and with very different cultures. Having behind it the Judeo-Christian tradition, Western Marxism echoed, not a few times as we have seen, with messianic motivations, the expectation of a communism conceived and believed to be the end of every conflict and contradiction, and so a kind of end to history. This messianism is largely absent in a culture like the Chinese, mostly characterized in the last millennium by the attention given to mundane social reality. If that's the whole reason that, like, the Eastern Marxists are able to actually deal with reality as it exists, and then the Western ones are just waiting for, like, some kind of individual hero like Christ figure, yeah, I mean, that would certainly explain a lot. If it just really boils down to religion, if we just have that many fucking retards here. The planetary expansion of Marxism was the start of a bifurcation process, which was the other side of a clamorous victory. It also historically happened to the great religions. As far as Christianity is concerned, it is not by chance that Engels repeatedly compared it to the socialist movement. The division between Orthodox on the one side and Protestants and Catholics on the other corresponds to the division between East and West. At a certain point between the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, it seems that Christianity was also about to spread en masse into the Asian East. Jesuit missionaries exercised a notable influence in China and enjoyed great prestige, having brought advanced medical and scientific knowledge. At the same time, they adapted themselves to the country that hosted them, paying homage to Confucius and the cult of religion. The Chinese emperor reacted by barring the doors of the Middle Kingdom to the missionaries. Christianity was treated favorably when it complied with its sinification and promoted the scientific, social, and human development of the country where it was allowed to operate. It was rejected as a foreign body when it was seen to be a religion of otherworldly salvation that in no way respected the culture and human and social relations in force in the country it operated in. Did I skip a but with the intervention of the Pope in the defense of the purity of the Christian religion? I think I might have just, like, skipped a line there. Sorry. Apparently, there were just two different times at which Christianity was trying to make a break into China, and at one point it was welcomed, and another point it was not. So, and the Pope was the defining factor then. With the intervention of the Pope in defense of the purity of the Christian religion, the Chinese emperor reacted by barring the doors. Okay. Something similar happened to Marxism. With Mao, the Chinese Communist Party promoted the, quote, sinification of Marxism, gaining momentum from the struggle for liberation from colonial domination, for the development of the productive forces to make possible economic and technological independence as well, and for, quote, making young again a nation with a 1,000-year-old civilization that had undergone colonialism and imperialism in the, quote, century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars. Far from being rejected by the leaders of the People's Republic of China, they proudly proclaimed the socialist and communist perspective. However, it was stripped of messianism. Second, its realization was delegated to a very long historical process in which social emancipation could not be disengaged from national emancipation. And again, it was the West that was the custodian of the orthodox doctrine, and it is again from Western Marxism that the disavowal would come. This time, the disavowal hits Eastern Marxism, which appears hardly credible and in any case banal from the point of view of a Marxism charmed by the beauty of a remote and utopian future, whose advent seems to be independent of material conditions, such as the geopolitical situation or the development of the productive forces, being instead exclusively determined and prioritized entirely by revolutionary political will. This disenchantment, this bifurcation, the schism of which we speak, does not take aim only at China. Western Marxism followed with participatory and impassioned attention while Vietnam was fighting an epic resistance in a colonial war that first saw France, then the United States as antagonists. But today, Vietnam is buried in oblivion while engaged in the prosaic task of economic development. Cuba no longer attracts the enthusiasm it did when it faced Washington's military aggression, unsuccessful in 1961, and for a long time afterward. Now that the danger of military intervention is remote, the communist leaders of Cuba aim to reinforce their economic independence. To accomplish this, they feel obligated to make some concessions to the market and private property, cautiously inspired by the Chinese model. So the island that no longer seems to be a utopia on the way to realization, but reveals itself to be in the grip of its own difficulties in constructing a post-capitalist society becomes less fascinating to Western Marxists. When it was still in its first stage, the military struggle for political independence, the anti-colonial revolution seldom gained from Western Marxism the sympathetic attention and theoretical interest it deserved. Now that the anti-colonial revolution is in its second stage, the struggle for economic and technological independence, Western Marxism reacts with disinterest, disdain, and hostility. Yeah. You know how many times a day I tell people that Cuba has a higher life expectancy than the US? And the response from everyone is just a resounding crickets. Leftists, conservatives, Democrats, like liberals, like whoever. They just don't care. Like, they do not care if other countries are successful, if they show a better way, because there is no mechanism in the brains of pig Americans to learn from another country, to look at human beings in another place as if they are actually human beings, and then try to model yourselves and your experience and your methods after theirs. Western Marxism's incapacity to consider the turning point within the turning point in the 20th century provoked the schism between the two Marxisms. While the clouds of a new Great War thicken, this schism is revealed to be more ominous than ever. It is time to put an end to it. Naturally, this will not make the cultural, social, and political differences between the East and the West disappear, nor the tasks that must be accomplished. In the West, the socialist prospect passes through a struggle against a capitalism synonymous with worsening social polarization and rising militarist temptations. However, we do not see why these differences should transform into antagonisms. Indeed, the excommunication inflicted by Western Marxism on Eastern Marxism has resulted not in the end of the excommunicated party, but of the excommunicator. Overcoming doctrinaire attitudes, the willingness to measure oneself against one's own time, and philosophizing rather than prophesying are the necessary preconditions for Marxism's rebirth and development in the West. Oh, I guess that's like the end. I mean, that's a hell of a way to end it too. I thought that was a very strong passage there. Yeah, I mean, that again pretty much sums up most of the prescriptions in the book, is that Western Marxists have to deal with reality as it exists and stop considering themselves utopian philosophers. Stop being like so fucking full of yourselves that you're not engaging with reality and you're just literally being like these philosophical pigs, basically. Like these just highfalutin idiots talking about some utopian future while doing absolutely nothing to meaningfully improve or impact the systems around them. So we're on to the appendix here. How Western Marxism Was Born and How It Died, by Domenico Losurdo, translated by Roland Bohr and Christina Pedersen. How much longer does this go on? No, I guess we still have a good 50 pages left. So yeah. Let's see. So section 1 of this, Western Marxism and the Suppression of the Colonial Question. Why did Marxism, after being extraordinarily successful and even becoming the the coin, Koine, or common language of the 1960s and 70s, fall into such a deep crisis in the West. Of course, the historical events that we all know and which culminated in the collapse of the Soviet Union and the quote socialist camp have played an essential role in this process. And yet, as indispensable as this kind of explanation may be, it is not enough. The analysis must be deepened, and attention must be directed to internal weaknesses that Marxism exhibited in the West even in the years when its hegemony seemed unchallenged. This is especially true in Italy. It is worth starting from a debate provoked by Norberto Bobbio in 1954. While rightly insisting on the indispensability of, quote, formal freedom and its juridical institutional guarantees, Bobbio credited the socialist states with, quote, initiating a new phase of civilizational progress in politically backward countries by introducing traditionally democratic institutions of formal democracy such as universal suffrage and the eligibility of offices, and such substantial democracy as collectivization of the means of production. And yet, according to Bobbio's critical conclusion, the new, quote, socialist state has so far neither been able to appropriate the rule of law and the liberal rule of law mechanisms, nor to, quote, limit power, and, quote, pour a drop of liberal oil into the gear of the already completed revolution. As you can see, we are far removed from the positions that the Turin philosopher took in his late phase, when he finally became an ideologist of the war of the West. It is 1954, 2 years before the 20th Congress of the CPSU and the Hungarian Uprising, and the influence of Marxism and the prestige of the countries that invoke it are very great. For Bobbio, in addition to the, quote, formal, there is also a substantial democracy, and by this he makes a judgment on socialist countries that is clearly not negative, even with regard to, quote, formal democracy. So I guess he's just saying they don't have enough of the what do you call it, like the performative institutions of democracy, and they have too much of the actual democracy. But how did Italian communist intellectuals react? In order to repudiate or mitigate criticism, especially of the Soviet Union, and to justify its partial backwardness in this field, they could have referred to the permanent state of emergency imposed on the country of the October Revolution and to the threat of nuclear annihilation, which continued to weigh heavily upon it. Galvano della Volpe, by contrast, pursued a completely different argumentation strategy, focusing on praising the, quote, libertas maior, the concrete development of the personality guaranteed by the material conditions of life. What does that mean? In this approach, first, the legal guarantees of the rule of law were devalued, implicitly degraded as the, quote, implicitly degraded to libertas minor. Second, Bobbio's glorification of the liberal tradition as an advocate of at least a universal validity of civil rights, of formal freedom, of libertas minor, of the general, quote, limitation of power was ultimately confirmed. In support of this view, the Turin philosopher invoked the hymn of praise to freedom that John Stuart Mill strikes up in perhaps his most famous treatise, On Liberty. But it is precisely in this work that we see the English liberals justifying the, quote, despotism of the West against the, quote, races still considered as, quote, minor, which must be forced into, quote, absolute obedience in order to be able to lead them on the path of progress. In 1954, despotism and the absolute obedience enforced by the West were very clearly felt in the colonial world. In the United States itself, blacks continued to be largely excluded from political rights and sometimes even from civil rights. In the southern states of the United States, the regime of racial segregation and white supremacy had not yet been eliminated. Entirely preoccupied with boasting about the libertas major, Della Volpe, however, makes no effort or is unable to draw attention to Bobbio's blatant failure. The displacement of the colonial question, albeit in a different form each time, is indeed largely characteristic of Western Marxism of those years. In 1961, Ernst Bloch published Naturrecht und Menschlich Word, Natural Law and Human Dignity. As the title already shows, we are far from Della Volpe's underestimation of the libertas minor. On the contrary, the author explicitly professes the heritage of the liberal tradition, which, however, is subjected to a criticism that unfortunately looks very much like a glorification. Bloch assumes liberalism of advocating, quote, formal and only formal equality. He adds, quote, for in imposing itself, capitalism took an interest in an evenly expanding universalization of juridical rules. This assumption can be read in a book published in the same year that the police in Paris carried out a merciless hunt for Algerians, who were drowned in the Seine or beaten to death. And all this in broad daylight, more precisely in the presence of French citizens who, under the protection of the rule of law, happily attended the spectacle, So much for, quote, formal equality. Thus, in the capital of a capitalist and liberal country, a double right applies, which excludes a specifically determined ethnic group that is subject to arbitrariness and police terror. If we then look at the colonies and semi-colonies, for example, Algeria or Kenya or Guatemala, a formerly independent country but de facto a U.S. protectorate, then we see the capitalist and liberal ruling state resorting to large-scale and systematic torture, concentration camps, and genocidal practices against the indigenous inhabitants. Of all this, there is not a trace in Bobbio, Della Volpe, or Bloch. Yeah, again, you just cannot take any of the Western Marxist thinkers seriously when they have this enormous fucking blind spot in what they're doing. Yeah, I went long on this one too, so I'm going to bookmark this one here. And I will switch over to the last one. So this is The Soviets Expected It by Anna Louise Strong. Let's see, where did I leave off here? What's going on here? There we go. All right, so picking up here with The Soviets Expected It. The military campaign had 4 distinct phases. The objective of the first phase was to move the border back from Leningrad and to isolate Finland so that the whole World War could not immediately pour through the northern gateway against the USSR. This objective was attained in 3 weeks. Hell yeah. The Red Army's first offensive pushed the land frontier 40 miles back from Leningrad and occupied the islands that controlled the sea approach. Simultaneously, the seizure of Petsamo, Finland's Arctic port, made impossible the importation of large forces by sea. The coldest Arctic winter for decades ushered in the second period of relative passivity, during which advances were consolidated and communication lines strengthened. The Soviet forces sustained some local reverses, which the American press exaggerated into major defeats. The war's third phase began with the first let-up of winter about January 13, 1940. It was a systematic air bombardment of the entire Finnish military embellishment. Systematic air bombardment of the entire Finnish military establishment, war industries, railways, ports, airdromes, and fortresses. The negligible number of civilian casualties, Finland officially reported only 640 civilian deaths from air bombing during the whole war, indicates considerable discrimination in this bombardment. Isn't it wild how, like, no matter who you read describing their own country's war efforts, they will say, we were very careful to not kill many civilians. We kept civilian casualties minimized. We only did the most tactical bombings. We only blew up actual military infrastructure. And all of our enemies exaggerated all of our defeats or our minor defeats into major losses. And most of the time, like, from their perspective, it seems like the Soviets are actually telling the truth in this case, but the fourth phase of the war began with the launching of an attack on the main Mannerheim line on February 11th. The system of fortifications was, quote, equal to and in some respects stronger than the Maginot Line or the West Wall. It was cracked in 1 month by a carefully considered attack. Stupendous artillery pounding dislodged the earth around the fortifications and threw their guns out of line while breaking the nerve of the defenders by unbearable shaking. Then the line was assaulted. It was the first time in military history that a line of such strength had been taken by assault. Its cracking was regarded as the, quote, most significant feat since the First World War. Finnish resistance collapsed with the breaking of the line. Hostilities ceased March 12th with the signing of a peace treaty in Moscow. 2 hours before the armistice deadline, the city of Vyborg fell before the last onslaught of the Red Army. Every effort was made by the British and French governments to prevent the signing of peace between Finland and the USSR. Britain refused to transmit the preliminary approaches. Finland then asked Sweden to act as intermediary. During the negotiations, Daladier put pressure on Finland, informing her that an Anglo-French expeditionary force was ready to sail, and that if Finland refused to ask for it, the Allies would, quote, not be able to assume any responsibility for Finland's territorial status, i.e. existence, at the close of the general European war. Oh, but Finland has a right to exist. Both Chairman and Daladier high-pressured the Scandinavian countries, demanding that they permit the passage of troops to the Finnish front. Chamberlain later admitted that this was expected to involve Sweden in war. On March 10th, Chamberlain intimated in the House of Commons that ways were being considered to force Sweden's neutrality in order to compel the continuance of the Finnish War. Let's see. London is buzzing with rumors of war on a much wider front, and perhaps war with Russia, cabled the New York Times correspondent on March 11th, 1940. The buzzing came too late. The attempt to shift the European war into Finland and create a world lineup against the USSR broke on Sweden's unwillingness to be drawn into the conflict and on General Mannerheim's incorrect estimate of Soviet strength. Mannerheim had told the Anglo-French allies that he would not need reinforcements until May. And by that time, Chamberlain expected to be able to force Sweden's agreement. Neither the Finns nor the British dreamed that the Mannerheim line could be cracked by a winter campaign. 2 months before the time set by Mannerheim for the Anglo-French reinforcements, the war was over. The Red Army had cracked the Mannerheim line and the Finns had asked for peace. In the peace terms, the Soviet Union extracted from Finland considerably more territory adjacent to Leningrad than had originally been asked. The Mannerheim line was taken and turned in reverse. The naval base at Hango was secured, but the Soviets returned Petsamo and the nickel mines near it, which they had captured. They asked no indemnities, but agreed on a trade treaty whereby they supplied Finland with food. As terms go, these were not excessive. Some people think today that the Soviets did not take enough. Petsamo today is in the hands of Nazi Germany, Finland's perennial ally. The Germans use it as a submarine base against Britain, as they did in the First World War. Sir Stafford Cripps, British ambassador to Moscow, thinks that the terms might well have been stiffer. As I sat in his embassy at tea in late 1940, he told me that all the Soviet annexations from Finland to Bessarabia had been necessary strategic moves against the coming attack by Hitler. He added, quote, "The Soviets may be sorry someday that they didn't take more of Finland when they could." Sir Stafford was wrong. Stalin's sense of timing is better than Sir Stafford's. The Soviets had to make peace when they did. Finland, it is true, was broken. She could not have stopped the Soviet march to her uttermost border. But behind Finland lay Sweden and the French and British troops. A march of the Red Army toward the Swedish border might well have melted Sweden's unwillingness to permit the passage of the Anglo-French armies. British, French, Swedish, and Norwegian troops would have brought the World War to the Soviet borders. The world front that today crystallizes against Hitler would have been crystallized a year earlier against the USSR. So Moscow was well advised in that swift peace signing. Besides, it was well to be done. No decent person, I think, can feel happy about the Soviet-Finnish War. The Soviet people I know were never happy about it, nor were their leaders. For Finland, it shattered an already depression-cracked economy and plunged the people into famine. For the Soviet Union, it shattered a hard-won reputation as a non-aggressive country and spread dismay among thousands of former friends throughout the world. But I think that if a hostile country were located in the middle of Long Island, which refused to agree with the U.S. government on a joint continent defense but set up against Manhattan fortifications provided by Germans and Japanese, the U.S. Army would attack it even more quickly than the Russians did. And again, that is always the analogy used when even talking about Russia and the United States today, when everyone is talking about if you're even just reasonable regarding the Ukraine situation, if you say the U.S. would have invaded, Cuba a lot sooner if Russia had been using Cuba to stock up a whole bunch of weapons designed to attack the United States. And that's exactly what the U.S. was doing with Ukraine. Finland is as near to Leningrad as the middle of Long Island is to Manhattan. A German panzer column, sheltered in the excellent offensive-defensive system of the Mannerheim Line, could have reached the heart of Leningrad in half an hour. When the Great War finally came, Leningrad had space, and space means time, to organize defense. Besides, the Soviet-Finnish War had victories outside Finland. The sequence of Soviet acts from the march into Poland to the peace treaty with Finland convinced the states of Eastern Europe that the USSR was strong and knew what she wanted. She was not like Hitler, making and breaking promises and eternally grabbing more. But she wanted definite things and gave her reasons and was serious about them to the point of war. One of the things she obviously wanted was a broad buffer belt from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Romania knew then that the time had come to give back Bessarabia, which she had seized from the young Soviet power in the days of its weakness in 1918. The population was not Romanian, but was allied to the Moldavians in the nearby Soviet Ukraine. It had risen against Romanian overlordship 153 times in different places in 6 years. Holy shit. The USSR had never recognized the validity of the seizure, but had never made it a cause of war. Romanian boyars, Bessarabian peasants, and the Soviet people all knew that someday the Soviets would take their country back, or take that country back. The Soviets were strong now. They had waited 22 years for the right moment. When Hitler was occupied with France, Moscow asked Romania for Bessarabia and got it without war. So Marshal Timoshenko, commander-in-chief of the Soviet forces, came home to the Bessarabian village where he was born. He embraced his brother, who was still a poverty-stricken peasant as the parents of both had been. The villagers made festival and stared at the son of theirs who, in 22 years, while time stood still in the village, had become a marshal of the great USSR. Throughout Bessarabia, garlands were laid on the graves of those thousands of long-tortured people who, through all the seemingly hopeless revolts, had believed in this hour. Trembling old men, receiving for their last years their measured bit of land from great estates, fell down to embrace their soil. Soviet ships sailed up the Danube, the northern branch of whose delta became the Soviet frontier. The long buffer belt across Eastern Europe was completed. From Hango on the Gulf of Finland to the Danube mouth on the Black Sea, as Hitler, from his ravaging of Western Europe, turned east. That's cool. You love to see it, folks. All right, cool. I got a few more minutes I can go with this one. So now we're on to Chapter 12, The Baltic Goes Soviet. I had the tremendous luck to arrive in Lithuania in July 1940, just after the Red Army marched in. I stopped in the capital Kaunas on my way to Moscow, expecting to spend a day. The day grew to a week, the week to a month. Lithuania had become important, perhaps even decisive for future world history. The Soviet Union was building in the Baltic states its border defense against the war that was shaking Europe. It was all being done so deftly that 9/10 of the Lithuanians I talked to thought, and rightly, that they were doing it themselves. Never in any land, in Spain, in Russia, or in China, have I seen a whole people so swiftly come alive. Day and night for weeks, singing did not cease in the streets of Kaunas. A year later, when I met Lithuanians in Chicago, I was surprised to find that they were considered and seemed to be a rather stolid people. They had been anything but stolid in the Lithuania I knew. A sovereign state was changing from capitalism to socialism quite constitutionally, without destruction of life or property. The thing had never happened before. Everything was so orderly, even so decorous, that it was hard to think of it as revolution. The talk was all of trade unions, of elections, of protecting public properties. What could be more sedate than that? Yet a new speed had hit this quiet land, and in a few short weeks it was traveling into the first stages of socialism. Nationalizing of land, of banks and industries, workers' control, Soviets. Quote, "The masses are moving," said one of the Lithuanian progressive intellectuals, quote, "and no one knows how far they will go." The odd thing about it is that was really the way it felt in Lithuania. Not like an occupation by an army or the seizure of territory, but like the release of forces among the common people, who rapidly began to organize. It was only when it was over and Lithuania had entered the Soviet Union that I and the people with whom I talked in Kaunas could see that it had been planned by Moscow and accomplished through the free choice of the Baltic people, which Moscow knew how to arouse. It seems that President Justas Paleckis must have known it from the first. During the Lithuanian elections, I remarked to the chief of the telegraph agency that many of the Kaunas intellectuals were dissatisfied by what seemed to be unnecessary speed, or by what seemed to them unnecessary speed. They wanted an election after the American or British manner, with plenty of time to organize political parties. Some of them felt that they were being railroaded by the speed with which the new trade unions and peasant meetings put up tickets and swept into an unopposed campaign. Quote, "A lot of us think it's a bit too speedy," answered the chief of the telegraph agency. Paleckis, I understand, wanted 6 months to take Lithuania into the Soviet Union, but Molotov said there wasn't time. At once, the friend accompanying me, she was one of those hesitant intellectuals, spoke up, quote, "You mean that otherwise Hitler would get us? Then let the Russians take us quick." Up at the foreign embassies, they spoke of it as the, quote, "death of Lithuania," but even they admitted it was not so simple. But even they admitted that it was no simple annexation, that something among the Lithuanian people themselves was going on. In fact, this disturbed them more than outright violence. A man at the American legation said to me, quote, "It wouldn't have been so bad if the Red Army had merely seized the country and established a protectorate the way the Germans do. But they've started something going among the lower classes that is undermining the whole social structure. You should see my janitor." Oh man, that's so great. I didn't see his janitor, but I saw tens of thousands like him, workers and peasants who were experiencing the thrill of unwanted power. For a month, I lived and moved among the common people of the Baltic, traveling hundreds of miles unhindered and unchaperoned. Among farmers and workers, fishermen and intellectuals, I saw the forces that the coming of the Red Army unleashed. It was an amazing revelation of the possibility of combining shrewd political planning with a people's open choice. The background may be briefly summarized. Treaties of mutual assistance had been concluded the previous October with the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, permitting the USSR to establish naval bases along their coast and to send there a mutually agreed number of Soviet troops. The governments of these states, however, were still in the hands of semi-fascist dictatorships, somewhat pro-Nazi, and at any rate anti-Soviet. Hundreds of Baltic workers were arrested for merely speaking to Red Army men. In Vilno, which the USSR gave to Lithuania, the Smetona government staged a pogrom against all those who had previously welcomed the Red Army. When Countess workers marched to the Soviet legation to thank them for the gift of Vilno, they were beaten up in front of the legation by the Countess police. Despite these occasions for friction, the treaties of alliance, which both sides had declared satisfactory, might have lasted undisturbed under conditions of relative peace. No such conditions of peace were granted. Hitler's armies, after a winter of quiet, plunged into Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France. All Europe trembled with the shock. Then Hitler signed the armistice with France and immediately began moving troops eastward. Pro-Nazi groups stirred in the Baltic states. Anti-Soviet incidents occurred. It was claimed by Moscow that Red Army men were kidnapped, tortured, and killed with the connivance of the Lithuanian secret police. Using these incidents as a ground, the Soviet government presented an ultimatum, demanding the formation of a government that would, quote, fulfill the Treaty of Mutual Assistance and asking the right, in view of the increasingly disturbed conditions in Europe, to send a much larger armed force into the Baltic states. The ultimatum was accepted. On June 15th, technically as allies and in agreement with the Baltic governments, considerable forces of the Red Army marched in. Quote, Stalin beat Hitler into the Baltic states by about 24 hours, was the considered judgment of an American in Vilno who had been a press correspondent in Eastern Europe for more than 10 years. Many Lithuanians told me that they agreed with him. Crazy. Yeah, I've kind of always had this impression that Lithuania has been like this, fairly fascist-leaning country, and it always seemed like it was mostly left over from these events in World War II, as seems the case with so many of these Baltic states. But you do hate to see it. It's unfortunate. It's like an unfortunate leftover effect, it seems, and it leads to things like that meme that was so popular. It was like a tweet from years ago saying like, all these people who have like this anti-Soviet nationalism, or you talk to like the mildest anti-communist in Eastern Europe, and it's like the person that they actually worship, that they think is good, is like Vilnius, the Jew slayer of. They're talking about it as if it was like Lithuania. So, and it just always reminds me of Vilno when they talk about the actual town. So, I also never realized how significant that was when, like, back in the day with Jaron on the old podcast saying that he was like, a descendant of Lithuanian people, like Lithuanian Jews. And it's like, did not really get the significance there until I started reading through this. But anyway, thank you guys all for joining me once again. I will see you again, hopefully tomorrow or the next day, but we'll see. Petrozell said in the chat, our Nazi neolib newly elected president glazed Netanyahu on his first day in office and said he, quote, supports the legionnaire resistance against communism in our mountains. Legionnarism was Romanian Nazism. Oh, cool. Yeah, very cool stuff going on in Romania. You'd love to see it. Oh, man. All right, you guys. Well, I'm going to end it here. I'll see you again next time.